name's Phil Chard, and I was told I was going to introduce myself, so it'll be short. I'm a psychotherapist by trade. I work at a company called Empathia, which is a nationwide provider of behavioral health solutions. And I also write a column in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Sunday column, called Out of My Mind, and I usually am, so it's an apropos title. And what we're going to be focusing on here this evening is a buzzword you've probably heard flying around in the media called mindfulness, and I'm going to demystify that a little bit for you. But I also want to preface that by saying that recently in the area of mental health treatment, you know, we have always struggled with better ways to help people with the challenges that we all face in our lives. And over the last 10 years or so, through studies about consciousness, how the mind works, and the ways that the mind can be disciplined to work, we've discovered new approaches to taking care of people that really weren't available just 5 or 10 years ago. So as we go through this material, I'm going to introduce some of those to you, but I also want to just give you a sense about what mindfulness is, because again, it has a lot of myths associated with it, and how it can be applied in your own lives to your own betterment. My background in this is that currently I'm a consultant to the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is a nationally recognized research center in Madison. They have about 40 neuroscientists there. And all they do is study the impact on the brain and on general well-being from meditation and other contemplative practices. And if you're sitting there going, already, there's no way I can meditate. I've tried it, it just doesn't work. There's lots of ways to be mindful that don't involve meditation, so don't check out right away if that's what you're thinking. As I go through this material, feel free to jump in with questions or comments at any time, provided they're not too long. And if you disagree with me, feel free to do that too. When I was about 15, I think it was, my mother told me I had an oppositional disorder. She didn't use those terms, but that's what she was saying. And I kind of still have it, so if you want to disagree with me, I'm cool with that. But let's jump right in, I hope. Did you hear me, computer? Let's jump right in. Okay. What burns us out? What are the kinds of things that really make it difficult for people to be able to sustain themselves over time in our culture? And I'm not going to list all these things for you, but I want to touch on a couple of these. I want you to look at that one at the top. High responsibility, low control. That's the stress formula. So any time in your life when you feel really under a great deal of stress, you might want to consider whether or not that particular paradigm is operating, where you feel like it's up to you, you got to get it done, it's on you to make it happen or turn out right or fix it or whatever the case may be. But at the same time, you feel like your level of control, your capacity to influence that outcome is diminished. So it's a sense of, I've got to do it, but I don't have the resources to do it. And when you get into that kind of a mode, and you stay in it long enough, you will get this thing we call burnout. The other ones you see up here are pretty familiar. We're going to touch on some of these. But change fatigue is another one. And in our society, things are changing so rapidly. And the more you're tied to technology, the more you experience that change. But they're changing so fast that there's no longer any breathing spaces. It wasn't that long ago that when some big change came along, we had time to assimilate it, to kind of get oriented to it, to adjust around it. And that's not happening much to us anymore. It's just like one right after another, kind of a continuous battering ram of changes. Not sure why this isn't working well, but I'll try it again. Some of the things that burn us out, you know, financial challenges, which by the way is the #1 cause of conflict in marriage, is arguing about money. What do you think number 2 is? Kids, somebody said kids, arguing about parenting. But all of these things out here are the kind of things that our environment can burn us out as well. And a couple of these are when we live in a family system or we are in a workplace where the orientation is strongly towards task, get the job done, get things squared away, and to the detriment of relationships. So, you know, if we have to run over a few people on the way, well, tough, you know, that kind of an environment. People also who have low emotional intelligence, if you know anybody like that in your life, you know how challenging that can be. People who just don't have this capacity for empathy or don't grow it in themselves have trouble relating effectively with others. If you spend a lot of time with those people, it burns you out. And then, of course, more poorly managed change, an unrelenting one, in addictions, which are very prevalent today in our society. So, when we looked at personality factors that make people more prone to burning out, in other words, I'm sure as you look at this list, you won't see anything that applies to you, but if you want to think about some of these, monkey mind is one of those. We get so hyperstimulated in our culture that after a while, the brain begins to orient itself around that degree of hyperstimulation, and we develop something called monkey mind. If you're not sure what that is, sit in a room with nothing to distract you. Nobody else there, no media, nothing to read. Just sit there with your eyes open, don't fall asleep, for 30 minutes and see what happens. And you'll probably experience monkey mind. It'll be like going to the zoo, you know, at the monkey cage when they're throwing stuff and screaming. That's kind of what your thoughts feel like. And some of you may have heard of a test that was done, a study that was done, where they took people, they were mostly young people, and it was because of a graduate program study. They put them in a room just like I described, nothing to do for 30 minutes, but they had one option to stimulate themselves. If they wanted to, they could administer to themselves a mild electric shock. What percentage of the subjects do you think actually did administer to themselves a mild electric shock? A little over 40%. So if you think about it, I mean, that's a pretty high percentage. I mean, personally, I don't think I'd want to do that, but that's how much the brain can be trained to crave stimulation, to the point where even pain is preferable to that sort of silence, if you will. So that monkey mind thing, control madness, well, there's something we call emotional hijacking, which we all experience. And that's when something pushes one of your emotional hot buttons and off you go. The part of the brain that controls emotion and fear, called the amygdala, kind of takes over. The rational brain, or the prefrontal cortex, kind of goes and lays down by its dish, and it takes you where it wants you to go. Something called external locus of control, which is nonsense, and I'll get into that in a minute. Highly sensitive persons. Some of these things are personality factors that will make you more prone to this thing called burnout. So there's a difference between stress and burnout. I'm not going to go through all these, but you can just see by looking at this list that stress that's manageable tends to be temporary. It's often situationally based, meaning you're stressed out by something in your environment, and that may change, or you can do something to change it. Whereas burnout is this condition where no matter how much you seem to rest or give yourself timeouts or go on a vacation or whatever, you just don't seem to be able to bounce back. And you're truly burned out. And so when we've looked at ways to help people with that, the science is pointing us more and more towards this state of mind or consciousness called mindfulness. And that's what brings me here tonight. So a couple of things about that. One of the big challenges that we face today is simply distractions. Technology actually alters neurology in the brain. So I'll give you an example of that. A number of years ago, I was with my 16-year-old son, and we had an afternoon together. It was raining. We said, oh, let's watch something on TV. So he grabs the remote, flips on the TV, and then he starts popping channels, you know, surfing channels to see what's there. Bam, bam, bam. Just going like this in front of me. And finally I said, stop. And he goes, what? And I said, how do you know what you want to watch? I mean, that's going by so fast you couldn't possibly. He goes, you can't see that? No, I couldn't see that because when I grew up, we didn't even have a TV in our house till I was 6. And so my brain wasn't trained on technology, nor were many of yours, in the way that really younger people are now. And their brains are wired to react and perceive differently than what most of us are used to. Here's a real quick example of the kind of stuff that I'm talking about when I say distractions. A little quick movie clip on this. Here we go. Relaxed? Okay. That's what I'm talking about. And here's what happens because of this. The human attention span was last measured scientifically in 2013 at 8 seconds, which means we're done. Okay? I mean, you've all gone. Okay? It was 12 seconds 13 years before that. What do you think what it was when they first started measuring attention spans in the 60s? How long do you think people could usually stay on focus before they distract? 10 minutes? Wow, that's a good one.
1 minute.
It was a bit over a minute, you know. So the ability to stay on focus has diminished dramatically, and we're to the point now where what we call attention deficit disorder is widespread, and not just in kids, mostly in adults. I love this quote. By the way, I have no idea how you measure the attention span of a goldfish. Yeah, somebody did, but you know, maybe it's what they just sit there, right, and they kind of go. I don't know. Anyway, the average attention span of the modern human's about half as long as whatever you're trying to tell them, and that's pretty much the case. So what happens is we are highly distracted, first of all, by our environment. But those distractions create a mind that's also distracted. So the distractions are coming from the outside and they're coming from the inside. And we're in the middle, as it were. The average employee today has 56 major interruptions at work every day. And we know that once you're interrupted, it's much more difficult to get back on task. So that's why, you know, what we're seeing is actually, despite technology, a productivity drop in a lot of work environments. And then the monkey mind, which I referred to, is that inner distraction coming at us. The result being that when you're with somebody, maybe just at a coffee shop or around the table at home or talking at work, they're not there about 47% of the time. Meaning their body's there, but mentally they are gone. Okay, and the same is true for us, of course. So what happens as a result of that is we make a lot more mistakes. And we've all heard about distracted driving and that sort of thing. Well, there's distracted walking and there's distracted everything. You may have seen the video clip a couple of years ago. The woman was walking through the mall with her, looking at her smartphone and walked right into the fountain, you know, just did a Brody right into the fountain and then sued the mall. Okay, because of course it's their fault. That's how distracted we tend to be. Part of the result of this is we get something called hurry sickness. And hurry sickness is driven by this clock we all have in our brains. You know, these things on our wrists and on our smartphones, they don't really measure time for us continuously. You have to keep looking at them to figure out what time it is. Okay, but your brain is constantly measuring what it considers to be the passage of time. And when that inner clock speeds up, so do you. Okay, so that's what hurry sickness is really about. I'm not going to put you through this, but I do when I do a workshop on this, I'll have people sit, close their eyes, and estimate the passage of 1 minute without counting. And when they think a minute's up, I ask them to raise a hand and open their eyes. And of course, I'm timing this as they do it. My record is 9 seconds.
Wow.
Okay, so think about what it's like going through life when your brain is telling you that 9 seconds, or excuse me, that a minute is passing every 9 seconds. I mean, you're really going at light speed. But what we know today is that that inner clock in the brain, for most people, has sped up dramatically over the last 10 years, primarily as a result of technology. Any questions about this so far? Are you still with me? Yeah? You really sure about that? Because 47% of you are? Okay. You know, you've probably done some public speaking, and you know, when you get up there, you're always looking at faces, and you're trying to like, are they still here? How am I doing? Is it okay? You know, and psychotherapists are really bad at this because we have so much of a need for feedback, you know. It's just oppressive sometimes. But if you see a certain facial expression on people, you know you're in trouble. And I call that facial expression frogs watching lightning. Okay, because you're like up here going, oh, yeah, throw point, and then you look out and it's like. So if I see too much of that, I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit. But the other thing about hurry sickness, by the way, if you don't believe in it, get out here on 43, get in the left lane, and go the speed limit. And you'll see all kinds of hurry sickness in your rearview mirror. Actually, don't do that. It was just for effect. The other challenge that we have today is people fatigue. Lots of us are in the people business, or we're otherwise engaged in our community in such a way that we have a lot of interaction with people. And provided you're interacting with folks who are compatible with you and all that, great. But if you're not, you develop this thing called people fatigue. And if you're an introvert, I am, then people fatigue is a real risk, okay? Because introverts, it's not that we don't like being around people or interacting with them, we do. But once we do that, it kind of sucks the life out of us, and then we need a lot of downtime, and we need time to be alone and sort of recharge our batteries. If your work, job, family, whatever, keeps you around people all the time, all the time, all the time, interacting, and you're an introvert, this is probably a real difficult issue for you. And then the last thing that really contributes to that burnout is something called compassion fatigue. If you have to take care of other people, or if you watch too much news, there's a pretty good chance you can develop compassion fatigue. Particularly if you are what we call a highly sensitive person. Has anyone heard that concept before, HSP? It's actually not a mental state so much as it's a neurological state. Highly sensitive people are about 20% of the population, more women than men. Many of them are in the helping professions or otherwise are helpers in their lives. But highly sensitive people really react at a very increased level of sensitivity, as the name implies, to things going on around them that are negative, hurtful, painful, and they absorb the pain and suffering of other people in a very direct way. So they're at particular risk of this thing called compassion fatigue. So if you know yourself to be HSP, I've had people say, how do you know if you're HSP? Well, things like you're driving down the road and you see an animal that's gotten hit by a car and you just look away. Or you know what kind of movies to not go to because you know they're going to bother you. Or what shows not to watch. Or what people not to talk to. But you're already in a defensive mode and trying to protect yourself because you know that sensitivity is there. Okay, those are the problems. Those are the stressors. And if you ever went to a stress management workshop, you know that one of the most irritating things about those is they spend like 90% of the time having you assess your stress level, which is usually high, and then, telling you how bad it is for you and how it's going to screw up your life and damage your heart and all this stuff. And then they give you like 5 minutes at the end to say, well, do some breathing. Okay. I'm not going to do that to you, okay? This is what a healthy mind looks like. This is research-based. I didn't make this up. I didn't get out of Cosmopolitan or GQ or something like that. Well, here's what we know about a healthy mind. First of all, healthy minded people, if you will, are present more than they're absent, mentally speaking. So that 47% figure I gave you, they're much more present than most other folks. They're emotionally balanced was just a fancy way of saying they're in charge of their feelings more than their feelings are in charge of them. There's times when we all get hijacked by our feelings. Nobody's perfect with this. But they are in a position where they're able to respond more rather than just react, okay? They're also emotionally intelligent. The relationship with being mindful or present, we'll get into that momentarily, and emotional intelligence, meaning the capacity to have, effective relationships with others, is very strong. They're also highly engaged. So they have this capacity to really engage with their lives, bring their energy to bear, and so on and so forth. And they have this thing called resilience. Resilience is basically just that bounce back capacity. Life knocks you down, you come back up. All of us get knocked down in life. And so this is a life skill. In fact, well-being and healthy mind is achievable. And that's one of the differences between this and some other things that we try to teach people in my field in psychology. Learning how to have a healthy mind is doable, and it's doable for almost anyone. All you have to do is learn what methods to apply in your own self-care strategies to make that happen. And I'm going to talk to you and give you examples of those methods here this evening. So I keep saying mindful, mindful. What does that mean exactly? It's pretty simple, actually. And it's actually relatively simple to learn. The hard part about being mindful is remembering to do it. Mindfulness means you're more self-aware. You're in touch with what am I experiencing now inside of me, my emotions, my thoughts, and so on. You're also self-regulated, meaning you're in charge of your feelings, they aren't in charge of you, and you're more emotionally intelligent as a result of that, able to interact with others in a more meaningful way. And what we know is that mindfulness can be learned, and we're calling it aerobics for the brain. There's a big push now for physical wellness, exercise, eat soundly, get plenty of sleep, and that's all great stuff. But there's very little being done about how do you exercise and discipline the mind. The mind being the instrument of consciousness or awareness. So how do you actually sort of do curls, if you will, with your consciousness to get it in shape? And that's what this is really all about. It's about exercising and optimizing the mind for your best performance. Now, I want to show you a brief video that explains a little bit of the science behind meditation, meaning what can you expect to gain by meditating? And again, you don't have to meditate to be mindful, but that's the approach they're taking here. I want to make sure that the sound is up correctly here so that you can hear this. Here we go.
For thousands of years, people have practiced meditation for spiritual, emotional, and physical well-being. But from a scientific perspective, how exactly does meditating affect your body? Does it really do anything? It all starts in the brain. During meditation, brain scans see increased activity in regions directly correlated with decreased anxiety and depression, along with increased pain tolerance. The default mode network, in particular, is activated when one's mind is at rest and not focusing on the outside world, and has been found to improve memory, self-awareness, and goal setting. Want to be more caring to your friends and family? When scientists compared the brains of Buddhist monks to new meditators, they found the region of the brain associated with empathy to be much more pronounced in the monks. It also literally changes your brain waves, and we can measure these frequencies. Meditators have higher levels of alpha waves, which have been shown to reduce feelings of negative mood, tension, sadness, and anger. And if that wasn't enough, it also physically changes our brain shape and size. Studies found that after 8 weeks of a meditation program, gray matter was more dense in areas associated with learning, memory processing, and emotion regulation. And yet the amygdala, which deals with stress, blood pressure, and fear, had decreased gray matter. When we look at the entire body, not only do we see decreased blood pressure, but it can also increase the variability of your heart rate. And while this may sound harmful, it actually plays a critical role in properly transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout your body. Think you're getting sick? In a study where both meditators and non-meditators were given the flu virus, meditators were able to produce a greater number of antibodies and had increased immune function. If we go a little deeper, we can even see changes on a cellular level. Your chromosomes have protective protein complexes called telomeres, which help reduce damage to your DNA and lower cell death. And a shortened telomere length has been linked to several diseases such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and cancer. Amazingly, when cancer survivors completed a meditation program, their bodies showed significant increases in telomere length. It's believed that psychological intervention, particularly decreasing stress, has a direct effect on the enzyme telomerase, which has been shown to counteract shortening by adding DNA to the shrinking telomeres. Of course, meditation is not a substitute for other medical advice or a healthy lifestyle. We don't want you leaving this video thinking it will cure cancer. But much like hitting the gym can grow your muscles and increase your overall health, it seems that meditation may be a way of working out your brain with extra health benefits. And since your brain controls, well, all of you, why not relax and say every once in a while?
You actually don't have to say I mean, you can if you like it, but it's not necessary. And you actually don't have to meditate to get these same effects. There are other ways to gain that, and we'll look at those. Any questions about that, about the science behind meditation?
I just noticed how fast he was talking. I wonder if that's part of that attention span that we were talking about before.
You may have noticed that particularly in informational and even certain entertainment videos, particularly the ones you see on YouTube or other places that post videos are getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and that's because of attention spans declining. At Empathia, where I work, we were in a discussion recently about creating a new video to promote our services among those who are eligible for it, and people in the room were lobbying heavily that we should only have that video be 2 minutes long. Because if we don't, people will check out and it's going to be all over. So yeah, that's part of it. Other questions? Yes, way in the back. How does it grow brain matter? Well, we know in general that when the brain is stimulated with new inputs, new learning, it grows new networks to accommodate that. So it's a very plastic organ in the body. It grows, it changes shape, it shifts around, it grows new networks. And that's not just for the young. I mean, brain plasticity, as we call it, goes right up until the time, we're gone. So basically, the brain is a very malleable organ. And as a result of the inputs that you get through meditation, it alters the structure and the functioning of the brain. That's why we're saying this is a learnable skill. You can actually create a greater sense of well-being in yourself through these practices in the same way, not in the same way, but parallel to the way you create better physical health through exercise and nutrition. Does that answer your question? Probably too much, huh? Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So, just as an example, after a 10 minutes, that's all, meditation, the brain goes from this state to this state. So right here, this is somebody who's right-handed because the left hemisphere is dominant here, and they're all lit up. Okay, this is monkey mind. You're looking at monkey mind as we see it in a brain scan. And then after 10 minutes, you can see how this is cooled, if you will, way down. The brain is much calmer. It's much more in this different state, if you will. And that can be achieved, again, through meditation, but also through something called mindful moments or mindful habits, which we'll get into in a bit. So this is not just a purely psychological effect. It is a neurological impact that any of us have accessible to us. So how do you get there? Well, there are 4 approaches that work. I mentioned mindful moments. Right now, I'm part of a project where we're teaching healthcare professionals, mostly physicians and PAs and nurses and so on and so forth, to use mindful moments between patient visits. And it only takes about 30 to 45 seconds to do a mindful moment. I'll show you what it is here in a moment. But what it does is it basically resets your central nervous system. It's sort of like when your computer gets slow and clunky and you restart it. It's kind of like restarting the brain. Okay, it sort of clears out the emotional cache and you have a fresh start. So we were teaching this to physicians because if they go from, say, one patient visit to the next patient visit to the next patient, and they're not doing anything in between except maybe charting and washing their hands, they're dragging whatever emotional residue there was from each of those visits. And so you can imagine if you're the last one on the schedule, you're in trouble. Okay, so how did that happen? Well, enjoy looking at it. At any rate, that kind of a process, the mindful moment process, is really the easiest way to create this state of mind, okay? And we'll get into how you do that in a moment, and I'll back up. Micro-meditation is just short-term meditation, usually about 3 minutes long, uses the same methodology as a more formal or longer meditative practice, but obviously it's shorter. If you do several micro-meditations during a day, several being 2 or 3, you'll get the same effects as if you sat down and did a 12, 15, or 20-minute meditation. Mindful habits are where you do things you already do every day, brushing your teeth, walking to the car, that kind of stuff, but you do it mindfully instead of off somewhere. So this morning, if you took a shower, were you there in the shower experiencing what it's like taking a shower, or were you mentally off thinking about your day or that stupid thing you said to the boss yesterday, or whatever. So that's the other method. And then finally, last but not least, is meditation itself, which is much more accessible than most people think it is. There's a tendency to think that meditation means you have to sit in a lotus position and chant and be in a cave and all that stuff, and it's just not true. So any questions about these methods before this slide auto-forwards on me again? Okay, I'll give you a taste of each of these, but now that we'll look at this thing, here's what being mindful or focused is really like. So just stare for a few moments, if you would, at the red dot. Just try to focus on the red dot. Okay, did any of you get it yet? What happens? Yeah, the blue either entirely disappears or maybe portions of it disappear and then come back. It sort of fades in and out, that sort of thing. That's what being mindful is like. You're focused on whatever it is you're dealing with in your environment. And so the distractions, the blue, fade away, or at least they don't dominate your experience. So that's part of the value of this methodology, is your capacity to really concentrate and focus on one thing at a time. Now, I mentioned when I started out that I consult with the Center for Healthy Minds at UW-Madison, and they're doing groundbreaking research into the application of mindfulness practices into everyday life. And they're working in school systems, they're working with healthcare professionals, they're working with law enforcement, and so on and so forth, to teach these people how to be mindful so that they can be at their best. So I'm going to show you another video. This is created by the center in Madison and describes their work, and it's primarily narrated by Richie Davidson, who's the lead director and lead scientist. Also has an interesting book out, if you're interested in it, called The Emotional Life of Your Brain, Richard Davidson. It's a New York Times bestseller. Okay, Richie, I gave you your hormone. Here we go. You owe me. Here we go.
Despite all the craziness in the world, despite all the chaos that we are all collectively facing, there are glimmers of hope and extraordinary opportunities for a much more compassionate, kinder, and supportive world. I'm Richard Davidson, and I'm the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I first met His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1992. That was a pivotal meeting for me, largely because he challenged me. He said to me, "You've been using tools of modern neuroscience to investigate anxiety and fear and depression. Why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and compassion, to study the positive qualities of life?" And I didn't have a very good answer for him. And it was a wake-up call for me to begin to orient our work toward a focus on well-being, on healthy qualities of mind, that eventually culminated in the founding of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds. The work that's being carried out is already having a direct impact. We're doing work in school settings with kids, which we think can help cultivate healthy habits of mind and set them off on a more positive developmental trajectory.
There were some opportunities for us to collaborate with the center around some research that they were doing. One of the things that collaborating with them did was afford us more formal instruction within the school and modeling for our classroom teachers who wanted to start trying out some practices with students about focus and attention and sitting, but didn't really know where to start. I'm Deb Hoffman. I'm the principal at Lincoln Elementary in Madison, Wisconsin. We do a lot of different things, from just trying to help students identify how they are feeling and giving them names for their feelings, helping them shift from calling somebody a name to understanding that they feel angry. If we teach them how to use their breath and relate to their emotions more, we're setting kids off in a way that they can cope with the larger world, hopefully a little more easily.
It's tremendously gratifying to see this work actually gaining traction in the world. And I see evidence of this now every day. We also are developing curricula to cultivate well-being in adults, including teachers as well as in medical professionals.
After kind of having emotional day after emotional day of worry and concern and anxiety, I started to realize that I would be running out of fuel soon. It was a problem I had to figure out. How can I find the peace or the stillness in my presence so that I could make good choices and exercise good judgment in nearly every situation that would happen 50, 60 times a day? I'm Chris King. I'm a cardiac surgeon at Harrison Medical Center in Bremerton, Washington. I knew a change had to happen. I just didn't know how, when, why, or what it would look like. I came across Richie's book, The Emotional Life of Your Brain, and I was so relieved because his work was echoing everything I was experiencing on my own. Wow, this is real. This is scientifically based. This stuff matters, and we have proof. That just reassured me I was on the right path and that I could go all in. I could feel a difference in my day-to-day. I could feel a difference in my activities. I could feel a difference in my interactions with human beings. When you start to live life, it becomes rich for the people around you. They enjoy the fact that you're present with them and that I'm not distracted by concerns, worries, or anxieties, I'm present with you right now.
People are beginning to wake up to the idea that well-being actually is accessible. We believe that the strategies that we're working with offer great potential to the world in many, many different contexts to help to promote well-being and to relieve suffering. And if we can have even a very modest impact on that, this work will have been well worth doing. Please join us on this extraordinary journey to help promote a kinder, more compassionate, and better world.
After this video was made, the Madison Police Department approached the center and said, we'd like to train our officers in this methodology because obviously they encounter a lot of situations that are going to push somebody's emotional hot button. So that's underway. It's also being done on an experimental basis in the United States Marines, the U.S. Army, and in healthcare centers throughout the United States. So this is really getting, as he said, traction, and it's starting to be applied. It's being applied in some of the school systems in Milwaukee. And so it's starting to gain a certain amount of momentum. And our hope, of course, is that when we reach young people with this, in the midst of their being bombarded with technology and the technology altering their brains' functioning and structure, that this will be a balance to that, and that will help to even that, if you will, struggle out enough that they'll be able to focus better than some of us adults. Any questions about that, by the way, before I move on?
How about applying it at the federal government level?
I'm not going there. I think it'd be great. I'd love to go to Congress and do a whole program for all the senators and representatives. But that's another story. So anyway, these are the known or scientifically proven benefits of having a meditative or mindfulness practice. Focus, we've talked about it. It actually reduces anxiety. It's being used now as a treatment for anxiety disorders. And there's actually a whole new form of therapy called mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy that incorporates these elements into the treatment of anxiety and depression. It actually increases creativity for those of you who are so inclined, reduces overall stress, which we're going to look at in a moment, increases memory, interestingly enough, reduces pain. Meditation is now being used extensively for pain control and is being used in some programs that are trying to address the opioid crisis. Richie referred to how it improves compassion in people. You are able to be more emotionally intelligent, more in touch with others, have greater empathy for others. Reduces depression, increases productivity, which I'm not all that fired up about anyway, and then gives you that emotional balance, meaning you feel like you're in charge of you rather than being under the sway of things happening around you. And it's also independent of those results. It feels good. It's a way to just be. We're so focused in this culture on getting things done and having stuff and doing things. And when we revolve into a meditative state, we're just being. And that feels good. It's kind of like you used to feel sometimes maybe as a kid when you'd lay in the sun on the beach in the sand and you didn't care about anything. Everything just kind of went away. It can get there. It takes some time to learn how to do that, but not as much as you might think. So one of the real benefits here is it interrupts something called emotional hijacking. Yeah, I can relate. This process, when we look at it in the brain, it's fascinating because when you think of a time when somebody, pushed your button and you just went off, okay? We can see that triggering mechanism in the brain in 50 milliseconds. 50 millionths of a second. Bam, you're activated. I mean, no time in between to go, well, how do I want to deal with this situation? You're just gone, okay? And then that emotional escalation just ramps up and drives your behavior. You start to act as if you are, in fact, hijacked. And this emotional hijacking creates all kinds of havoc in families, in workplaces, in relationships. And so it's a big, big issue today. And we talk all the time about people losing it. Well, this is what losing it looks like. I mentioned a moment ago that we're training physicians, nurses, PAs, and so on in how to deal with emotional spillover between their patient visits, and that's what this is really about. Because what happens if we don't clear the cache in the brain, the emotional baggage, as it were, keeps piling up and piling up and piling up and affects our interactions, not just with people, but how we feel inside of ourselves as well. You know, the Roman word for baggage is impedimenta. And so it impedes us. I actually learned that at the Milwaukee airport. I was on my way to catch a flight to go on a backpacking trip. And so I had this huge duffel bag, and I had this backpack over this, and I was just hauling all this stuff like through the airport, and this older gentleman was walking out of the airport, and he goes, "Stop!" I went like this, and he goes, "Do you know what the Roman word is for baggage?" I said, "No." He said, "Impedimenta." I said, "I feel it." You know. So the same kind of thing applies emotionally. So for example, you've had a hard day at work or wherever, you drive home, you pull into the driveway, you're dragging all that stuff with you. You drag it into the house with you. First person you interact with, whether it's a human being or your dog or your cat or whatever, they get it, okay? So one of the things we're training people to do in the workplace now is when you pull in that driveway, shut the car off and sit there for 2 or 3 minutes and do this mindful moment technique. Reset your brain so that when you walk into the house, you're maybe not a new person, but you're at least a refreshed one. And that emotional spillover effect is really one of the primary benefits of being mindful. Questions about any of that? Please.
I'm kind of wondering about the role of adequate sleep. And is sleep a form of meditation?
We don't sleep anymore, so I don't need you to worry about it. The role of sleep is profound, as you know. If you don't sleep well, it messes with everything. You know, your physical well-being, your mental acuity, your capacity to perform whatever you do. It just messes with everything. But here's the other side of this. We know that meditators sleep better. And part of the reason for that is what we call the default mode of the brain. If your default mode is monkey mind, then when you go to bed and try to turn it off and go to sleep, even when you're successful in falling asleep, you're still going to have a much more active brain function going on while you're asleep. You're going to wake up more often, okay? And it's going to be harder for you to get back to sleep. So meditation and mindfulness actually promotes more positive sleep. But when you're when you're sleeping, no, you are not in a meditative state. Sleep states are distinct from meditation. There are 5 primary sleep states. The shallow one where you do most of your dreaming is called REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. If you were to look at somebody who is dreaming, what you'll see is their eyelids fluttering, and their eyes are moving rapidly because they're dreaming. Then there's what we call, isn't this great labeling by psychologists? Stage 1, 2, 3, 4. These sleep stages are deeper, deeper, deeper. Excuse me. So when you get to stage 4, which is where you have your deepest rest, that's where you really get replenished. And what happens for a lot of people when they have monkey mind or they're hyperstimulated by technology is that they start to go down, but they never make it to 4. They come back up. And they get this shallow pattern instead of this deep pattern like this. When you don't have the deep pattern, you're not getting the rest. And you can even get 8 hours and you'll still wake up going, wow, I'm tired. You know, what happened? By the way, have any of you ever been hypnotized? A few folks. A hypnotic state of consciousness is unlike any other state we see. It's not like just being deeply relaxed. It's not like being in a meditative state. It's not like being asleep. It's certainly not like being awake. It's its own animal. And we're just beginning to study it and understand it better, even though, you know, people have been using hypnosis for hundreds of years. That was just a side note. So a little bit here about emotional self-regulation. I'm sorry, yes, sir?
I just wanted to ask about breathing techniques. Does that have a lot to do with mindfulness or getting to a different state?
It does. The breath controls consciousness to a profound degree. And if you don't believe that, just hyperventilate for a few minutes and you'll have a panic attack, okay? So breathing is tied closely to emotional states. And so in meditation, almost always when people are learning to meditate, they focus on their breath. And they use a particular kind of deep, or what we call belly breathing, to promote a relaxed state. The mindful moment technique is a specific breathing technique that I will show you in a moment, that if you do it exactly the way they say, will give you that reset that I was talking about of the central nervous system. So meditation, mindfulness, and breathing are all very closely aligned.
And how would something like Tai Chi or yoga fit into those categories?
Very well, depending on how you do them. If you're in a yoga class where, you know, they got the MP4 player going all the time and the instructor's squawking at you, no, okay, that's not going to get you there. Tai Chi a little bit more usually, but if you do yoga in a mindful way, and that means you're focusing not just on the asana or the postures, but also on your breathing, yes, it can create a meditative state. And Tai Chi is actually better at that than yoga, because Tai Chi is all about the paradox between control and flow. You know, if you're too tight, you can't do it. If you're too loose, you can't do it. You got to be in this sort of sweet space, and that requires focused concentration and mindfulness to pull that off. So those are what we call, by the way, moving meditations. And walking is another way you can do a moving meditation. You don't have to do yoga or Tai Chi. Here's a brief video about the impact of mindfulness on emotional self-regulation. The narrator here is Dan Harris. You know Dan Harris? Who's become kind of an advocate for this, though he's funny. He was very skeptical about it at first and kind of laughed at it, and he still kind of pokes fun at it. But he's embraced it and realizes its power, and he's the narrator behind this little video. Here we go.
You may have heard this word mindfulness. It's become something of a buzz phrase of late. I'm going to give you one simple, serviceable definition, which is this. Mindfulness is the ability to know what's happening in your head at any given moment without getting carried away by it. Imagine how useful this could be. Just as an example, you're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off in traffic. How do you normally react? I think most of us, we normally react by having a thought, which is, I'm pissed. And then what happens next? You immediately, habitually, reflexively inhabit that thought. You actually become pissed. There's no buffer between the stimulus and your reaction. With just a little bit of mindfulness, in that same situation, you might notice my chest is buzzing, my ears are turning red, I'm having a starburst of self-righteous thoughts, I'm getting angry. But you don't necessarily have to act on it and chase that person down the road, screaming at them with your kids in the back of the car thinking you've gone nuts. Now, you might be thinking, don't I need to get angry sometimes? Aren't I justified? I would say yes, but probably not as much as you think. The proposition here is not that you should be rendered by mindfulness into some lifeless, non-judgmental blob. The proposition is that you should learn how to respond wisely to things that happen to you, rather than just reacting blindly. And that, my friends, is a superpower. How do you get it? The way to get it is through meditation. I believe that meditation and mindfulness are the next big public health revolution. In the 1940s, if you told somebody you were going running, they would have said, who's chasing you? But then what happened next? The scientists swooped in, they showed that physical exercise is really good for you, and now all of us do it, and if we don't, we feel guilty about it. And that's where I think we're headed with mindfulness and meditation. It's going to join the pantheon of no-brainers like brushing your teeth, eating well, and taking the meds your doctor prescribed for you. Let me just close by saying, mindfulness is not going to solve all of your problems. It's not going to render your life a nonstop parade of unicorns and rainbows. Nonetheless, this is a superpower, and one that is accessible by you immediately.
So one of the really big selling points, if you will, for mindfulness practices today is this. It's the capacity to be in charge of your own feelings instead of having them run you, because we all know where they run you, usually to unhappy places when they get hijacked. So that's the power that we're talking about here. And this method, the breathing or the mindful moment, or what some people call the breathing break method, is really the easiest and the most applicable way to use mindfulness in your life. You can do it almost anywhere, almost any time. I do it in meetings all the time because it's much more interesting usually than what's going on in the meeting. But let's go through this, okay? Let's do this right now quickly. It can only take a minute. Put your feet flat on the floor if you would, please. And maybe have your hands unfolded or in your lap or on your thighs, whatever the case may be. It's doing it to me again. But you don't need to worry about that. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do is a few deep belly breaths. And by belly breaths, I mean when you inhale, your belly should come out, meaning your diaphragm is expanding. So you get a full breath. And when you get to the top of that breath, you pause. And then you exhale. Inhale through the nose. Exhale through open lips, okay? So let's do 3, 4, 5 of those right now. Close your eyes. Inhale deeply through your nose. Pause at the top of the breath. And then exhale fully through open lips. Let's do that now. Okay, now those of you that are still awake, what you just did, and we didn't do it as long as generally would be helpful, but what you just did was you reset, okay? And you probably feel a little bit different coming out of that than when you went into it. So think about doing that throughout your day. For example, I know we jumped ahead, but just ignore that. That's like saying to somebody, don't think about elephants, you know? But anyway, when we have staff meetings where I work, we start the meeting by doing this. We end the meeting by doing this. We put bookends, if you will, on either end of that event. And the bookends say, be fully present when you're here. And when you leave, don't take this with you. Be fully present in your next experience as well. So you can think about how you might want to apply that in your own life. But you can see how using that method, which is very short, easy to learn, and very doable in almost any situation. You can even do it driving, but don't close your eyes. It gives you the capacity to start self-regulating your own emotions, be more aware so you have more control over your consciousness itself, that instrument of awareness that we all rely on for so much of what we do. And it's highly learnable technique. The other thing that we encourage people to do in addition to mindful moments is mindful habits, and I referred to that a moment ago. There's been a lot written and said recently about mindful eating, and there have been studies done on folks who are trying to, eat in a healthier way to see if mindful eating actually promotes that, and the outcomes so far suggest that it does. That when we eat mindfully, which you can't always do. I mean, if you're out to dinner with people, you're not going to say, hey, everybody shut up, I want to eat mindfully. But if you eat mindfully when you're by yourself, mindfully means I'm actually absorbed in the sensory experience of eating rather than mentally off somewhere thinking about something that's going to happen or already did happen. Then you'll enjoy the food more. This is what the studies show. You'll enjoy the food more, you'll eat less of it, and you'll feel more satisfied when you're done. And so mindful eating, I mean, how many times have we done this, right? You sit down for a meal, and then it's like over in 5 minutes, and you go, what was that? What did I eat? That's mindless eating. Bathing is another great opportunity. One of my colleagues is really big on brushing your teeth mindfully. Up to you. Walking from your house to, the store or whatever, and instead of thinking about what you're going to do, actually experiencing what it's like to walk, the feel of it, the air, the sights around you. It's about being in touch with the present moment. And when we do that, it changes the way the brain operates. If you do this enough, if you do mindful moments enough, if you incorporate mindful habits into your life, if you meditate, that default mode of monkey mind is going to eventually start to flip. And it'll get to the place where the new default mode, meaning the place your brain goes to most of the time, unless it has a reason not to, is going to be this more relaxed, focused, self-regulated state. And that's what we're after here. Because if you're only getting emotional self-regulation when you're meditating, then that's what, 15 minutes out of the day? You have to have this ripple out effect so that it affects all of your day, all of your waking day. And that's what we have found in the research. It does do that. If you don't, then here's where you end up. You end up in the old Pavlov's dog thing. You know, remember Pavlov's dog? They ring the bell, the dog salivates, and they ring the bell. The dog. Stimulus reaction, okay? That 50 millisecond movement from somebody just said something that really set me off, or did something that really set me off, or cut me off in traffic, boom, right into the emotional reaction. Nothing in between. What we find in mindful people, because of that switch over to that different default mode, that when they get that hot button push or trigger, there's actually a pause in their consciousness in the brain. They're able to actually say, how do I want to react to this, as opposed to just reacting to it. So they become responsive rather than reactive. And that, of course, keeps us out of all kinds of unhappy circumstances. Now, that's not the only way to get emotional self-regulation. There are other methods that do that. One of them's called power posing, which I'll get into in a minute. Mindful moments, which you just did. Micro meditation, which is just a short-term meditation, 2-3 minutes. Going outside is another way to emotionally self-regulate, because we know that when people go outside, even if you just walk out the door of this building, you don't have to go to a park. If you go outside for 5 minutes, what we see in the brain is an uptake of serotonin, which is a chemical, it's a feel-good chemical in the brain. So that's one way to do it. Music is another way we can self-regulate, depending on what you listen to. And then micro-exercise is the other way that we do it, because anger, stress, anxiety, depression, all those feelings that none of us are particularly fond of are physical, not just emotional. They're bound up in our physiology, our muscles, and the way our bodies operate. So you can use the body to release some of that by doing micro-exercise. You know, run up and down the stairs, drop and do 20, you know, that kind of thing. Also helps to reset the brain. So it's not just dependent on mindfulness. I think, that's Michelle Obama there doing 20. I mentioned power posing. Any of you heard of power posing? Any of you seen the controversial back and forth studies on power posing? Yeah, the power posing idea came out about 7 or 8 years ago, maybe. It was based on research done by a Harvard psychologist by the name of Amy Cuddy. And she did this initial research. They did some replication studies, and it looked like, this really works. Then one of the other people did the research where it came out and said, no, it's all a fraud. And now there's this huge debate going in the psychological community, because we don't have anything else to do, about whether or not it's valid or not. But based on what I've seen in the literature review, I think the odds are better that it does work than it doesn't. So that's why I'm going to tell you about it. Power posing is a way to use your physiology and your breathing to, again, be in charge of you, okay? And as opposed to being under the control of your out-of-control emotions. And what you do is you power pose for 2 minutes. And you can see the power pose. It's Wonder Woman, right? This is the Wonder Woman pose. And when you power pose for 2 minutes, 2 things happen that we can measure inside the body. One of them is that testosterone goes up. Don't get excited, guys. And the other one is that cortisol goes down, okay? In this case, testosterone just makes us feel more confident. Oh, I can handle it. Cortisol is the primary stress hormone, so that goes down. Remember right at the beginning, I told you about high responsibility, low control being the stress formula? This flips it. So immediately you feel more power to get things done and less out of control, okay? So power posing is an interesting way to also reset. And when you breathe deeply as you power pose, you get an amplification of the effect. Example. Couple 3 years ago, I guess it was, I was asked to give a keynote at a conference for public school administrators in Wisconsin who were not happy at the time, okay? There's a lot going on in education that they were unhappy about, and so it was a very raucous kind of conference. So I decided I better go early to check out what's happening, you know? So I went in and watched the guy who went up, spoke before me, and this guy he was up there kind of giving them the motivational, you know, rah, rah, we can do it, you know, kind of thing, and they just eviscerated this guy. I felt really bad for him. So I'm sitting there going, I'm going to get creamed, because they would ask me to talk about something called realistic optimism. You know? So I was, boom, ba boom, ba boom, that kind of thing. And so I went into the John, went into one of the stalls, closed the door, stood there in power pose and breathed for about 3 minutes to get myself under control. And then I went out, got up on the stage and did my thing, and it actually went pretty well. Nobody threw anything or that kind of stuff. So that's power posing, and it's a good thing to do just before you're going to go into a high performance kind of situation, whether that's a tough conversation with somebody, or you got to get up and give a speech, or who knows what. Any questions about power posing? Yes?
They actually, didn't she have a TED Talk on it? And she demonstrated on the TED Talk.
Thank you.
Very, very well.
It's an excellent, do any of you do TED Talks? Okay. If you go to TED.com, they got a little search box there and just put in power posing. And the video you're referring to will come up. It's a wonderful 20-minute description of the method. She displays it, and she also talks about how she used it in her own life to get through some difficult circumstances of her own. I highly recommend it if you're interested. Thanks for bringing that up. Oh, I'm going to show you a real quick reset, how it works. It's just faster than it usually works, but it's kind of fun to watch. How many of you saw the movie Jerry Maguire? Most of you. Jerry Maguire was like a sports agent, right? And remember that really bad day he had? Like he gets fired. He loses every client except one, and he has to fly across the country and pitch his services to what's going to be the #1 pick in the NFL draft. So he gets off the plane. His life's falling apart around him. He's frazzled. He's crazed. He goes to the place where he's going to go in and talk to the father of this draft pick, and he has to get himself together. Watch what he does. Just did a real quick kind of power pose, reset. Just, if it was me, I would have done it longer, but now I'm ready. He also, you notice, put a little smile on his face. Here's a funny thing about that. When we smile, even if it's a fake smile, it sends a message to the brain that makes us feel more confident. So, smile while your heart is breaking. Now that sort of thing really works. So we've talked about emotional, or I should say, I've talked about emotional self-regulation. Here's what that's all about. Something called locus of control. This is one of those things where people in my profession make up words you can't understand to explain things you already know. Okay. External locus of control simply means that your default mindset is that what goes on out here determines what goes on in here. Meaning if it's a bad day out here, it's a bad day in here. It's a good day out here, it's a good day in here. So outside controls inside. If you have an internal locus of control, it's exactly the opposite. No matter what's going on out here, you remain in charge of what's going on in here. So you can see the advantage of having an internal locus of control. And what the research tells us is that mindful people have that more often than not. Now, nobody spends all their time in just one of these, okay? We flip back and forth depending on what's going on. But mindful people spend a lot more time being in charge of their insides, regardless of the outsides, than people who have this external locus of control. Why does that matter? Aside from the emotional regulation part of it, it also matters in terms of your health and your well-being. So now I'm going to show you a brief video from a TED Talk by a health psychologist talking about a study done at the University of Wisconsin School of Public Health. And it shows, this isn't specifically about mindfulness. I think it will give you a very good idea of how powerful your default mindset is. Meaning, do you have an external default mindset or an internal default mindset? So let's take a quick look at this.
Let me start with the study that made me rethink my whole approach to stress. This study tracked 30,000 adults in the United States for 8 years, and they started by asking people, how much stress have you experienced in the last year? They also asked, do you believe that stress is harmful for your health? And then they used public death records to find out who died. Okay. Some bad news first. People who experienced a lot of stress in the previous year had a 43% increased risk of dying. But that was only true for the people who also believed that stress is harmful for your health. People who experienced a lot of stress but did not view stress as harmful were no more likely to die. In fact, they had the lowest risk of dying of anyone in the study, including people who had relatively little stress. Now, the researchers estimated that over the 8 years they were tracking deaths, 182,000 Americans died prematurely, not from stress, but from the belief that stress is bad for you. That is over 20,000 deaths a year. Now, if that estimate is correct, that would make believing stress is bad for you the 15th largest cause of death in the United States last year, killing more people than skin cancer, HIV, AIDS, and homicide. You can see why this study freaked me out. Here I've been spending so much energy telling people stress is bad for your health. So this study got me wondering, can changing how you think about stress make you healthier? And here the science says yes. When you change your mind about stress, you can change your body's response to stress.
And so people who have an internal locus of control, most of the time, and those tend to be mindful people, can go through a lot of stress but not experience the physiological or psychological damage associated with that condition. So this is a real life skill and one that we can all access and has a profound impact on our well-being. How am I doing? You okay? You still with me? That's surprising considering the attention span thing. A couple other things, and then we'll move towards the end, and any questions you have I will address. But I referenced emotional intelligence. Mindfulness and emotional intelligence are closely related. And in fact, Richie Davidson, who you saw in the center's video, and Dan Goleman, who some of you may know is sort of the guru of emotional intelligence, have written a book together about that interplay between mindfulness and EI. EI looks like this.
So what is empathy?
I don't know.
Why
What is empathy? I think this is my auto program, and I didn't fix it, so I'm paying for it. But anyway, it looks like this. 4 quadrants. Self-awareness, I know more about how I feel while I'm feeling it. Self-management, that's the ability to regulate my feelings. Social awareness, which is empathy, which you just heard. And relationship management, ability to take all that and develop effective rapport with other people. If you're mindful, your capacity to do this goes way up. Be nice. Thank you. So, mindful people almost get an immediate boost in some of these capacities for EI. And the beauty of EI is that you can learn it. We talk about IQ, which is the intelligence quotient, and then EQ, which is your emotional quotient. EQ you can raise by effort. IQ, you kind of get what you got. That's it. So this is a capacity, again, that we can grow on ourselves, for ourselves, to the extent that we feel that would be helpful. By the way, any of you in the business world or work world, emotional intelligence is the #1 attribute associated with effective leadership. They can know everything, they can be business whizzes, but if they don't have EI, they're going to be a crummy leader. And the data bears that out. So you might want to tell your boss that the next time. Actually, you might not. So let's look at empathy, because that's the most important component. I've got a short video, which you already started to see the beginning of, about empathy and what it's like and how important it is and how much it relates to being mindful. So here we go.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, Not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So this is where mindfulness begins to morph from being more inward directed. How do I regulate me? How do I take care of me? How do I create the right kind of default mindset? To how does this relate to other people? How does it help me to be a better human being with my fellow human beings? And what it does is it creates this capacity to be present. She just talked about that. You know, what helps people to heal is not the right words to say, or it's the fact that you connect with them and they feel not alone. That's what helps to promote that sense of healing. And mindful people, because they're more present, they're not as distracted, they're more in control of their emotions, and they're more thoughtful in the way they respond to things, are able to engage with others in a much more powerful way. And so their capacity to be a healing influence on others, not just themselves, goes way up. This is based on the principle of building rapport. And the studies are very clear about this. When you're trying to build rapport with somebody, that sense of we get each other, we're connected, we know what we're about together, word choice, word content is 7% of the effect. So picking the right words within reasonable limits isn't going to help you. Okay? What does is the sound of your voice, okay, and your body language, as we call it. That comprises 93% of the rapport effect. And it's so powerful, this effect, that even when somebody's really bad with the words, if those other things are present, those other points of connection are there, the individual will feel heard and they will feel in sync with you. So we call this pacing. Are any of you familiar with pacing or mirroring? Yeah, lawyers and salespeople use this all the time. Or I should say litigators and salespeople use it all the time. Pacing is a process where when you're with another human being, you let them lead the dance. Okay? Meaning you listen to their voice, you watch their body language, their gestures, their facial expressions, and you get yourself in sync with that. You follow their lead. It's like being on the dance floor and they're leading and you're following, okay? And what we know is when you get yourself into sync with another person in terms of the vocal qualities and the body language, they feel connected to you. And that requires a high degree of presence and engagement and being in the moment to be able to pull that off. Now, years ago, I taught at Michigan State at the College of Human Medicine. And in one of the family practice residency programs, we were given the task of teaching the family practice residents how to be better communicators. And so what we did was when they would go in with their patients and have the interview phase of the exam, we would videotape them. with everyone's permission, of course. And then afterwards, we'd sit down with the doc and we'd review it. And we'd try to keep, well, you could have said this, or you could have said, it was all about words. And it was an abysmal failure. The study was a total failure. Didn't increase rapport with patients at all. So then we got really frustrated and we said, well, let's go back and look at the tapes. So we turned the sound off so we couldn't hear the words, and we just watched them. And then we sped the tape up. And what we noticed right away was that when in the exit interviews people reported higher levels of rapport, we could see looking back that they were kind of dancing with each other. When you speed it up, you can see the dance much more clearly than when it's in regular motion. And so as a result of that, we started training the doctors how to do this rapport building technique. It's based on something called mirroring. Watch your patient. Pay attention to how your patient's posture is, the gestures they use, their facial expressions, and their vocal qualities, volume, tempo, and tone of their voice. And don't mimic them, but get closer to them in your own feeding back, if you will, of those same qualities. And when you do that, you start to do the equivalent of ballroom dancing. You know, you're in sync. It feels good, and everybody's feeling, oh, this is fun. And you get rapport effect. If you don't do it, you kind of dance like we did in the 60s, you know. One person's going like this, the other person's going like that, you know, that sort of thing. It's way out of whack, okay? So that's how you build rapport, and the research shows us that mindful people tend to do this without even thinking about it. It's just part of being present with another person. So it's a very powerful method. I use it a lot. Certainly use it in therapy a great deal. But I do want to enter a caveat into this if you're thinking about, you know, I'm going to try that with so-and-so, because we just don't seem to quite connect. I'm going to try to do this and see if we connect. Don't do this with your adolescent kids. It's funny, but I'm being serious about that. And the reason is most adolescents, not all, but most adolescents have this sort of built-in subconscious program that says, towards their parents anyway, I don't want to be like you. You know, because they're trying to individuate. They're trying to be their own person. There's exceptions, but that's fairly standard. So when they get the sense subconsciously that you're really connecting with them and you're really in sync, they'll be repulsed. Okay, so they'll push you away. So it's not so good with teenagers, but it works great with little kids, by the way, who do it with each other all the time. And it works really well with adults because adults are unconscious. Most of the time, they don't know what you're doing anyway. So give it a try, see if it works. It's a powerful way to take the mindfulness practice and bring it out into your relationships with other people. And why does that matter? Well, the late, great Maya Angelou said, people may forget what you said, they may forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you make them feel. And mindful people have this capacity to engage with others in a positive way that helps them to feel better. Questions about any of this before I start to go into the home stretch? Okay, a couple quick things and then I'll cut you loose. The last thing we know is that mindful people have greater resilience, that bounce back when life knocks you down capacity, because they have this internal locus of control. They're in charge of themselves. They're present. They have greater emotional intelligence, and they practice supportive self-care. They do things that will help them to be strong, so to speak, in the face of adversity. And we've already talked about what those things are. You alluded to it in your question: sleep, exercise, proper nutrition, and contemplative practices. That's the one we're now adding to the list, okay? Of those three that everybody has been pounding on and harping about for so long, you know, sleep, exercise, good eating, add that, contemplative practice, whatever you want that to be for you. And by the way, many of you probably have engaged in contemplative practices of various sorts on your own. You know, I mean, prayer is an example of contemplative practice. Any Catholics in the room, the rosary is a form of meditation. I mean, so there's lots of other traditions that pull this in. But if this isn't part of your self-care strategy, you're missing a very, very important piece. The other thing we know then is that habits, meaning developing these self-care strategies as habits, not only improves your well-being, but it also helps you to relax. Habits reduce our anxiety. That's why we like them so much. The familiar, the predictable. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to think too hard about it. If it's a habit, it's like, oh, I can just glide. I can just not worry about it too much. So habit forming is part of this whole process. We also know that many people who are mindful engage in one or more of these self-care behaviors. We've hit on these already: exercise, nutrition, sleep, but these other ones as well. And I just want to touch on a couple of these. The one at the top. There's lots of studies showing that when you engage in some kind of creative, expressive activity, that it creates a uptake, again, of serotonin in the brain, and you're less depressed. So woodworking, knitting, needlepoint, painting, playing a musical instrument, all of these things that involve using your hands, journaling's another example, by the way, to create something has an antidepressant effect. We're not exactly sure why, but who cares? It works. You remember when you used to sit and watch Grandma do the, with the needles, knitting needles? She was actually taking an antidepressant. Okay, so. The other one I referenced is nature. That has a very powerful self-care capacity for it. In Japan, they have something called forced bathing. You heard of that? Where they actually talk about going out and bathing, so to speak, in a sensory fashion in the forest, in the sounds and the smells and the scenes before you, because it has such a powerful self-care effect for us. So those are other things to add to your list, if you will, of self-care methods. Last thing I wanted to present to you is about habits. How do you build a habit? Because this is where, you're probably sitting out there going, well, this is kind of neat stuff, but, I'm a busy person, and I often start these things, and then I fall off the wagon, and I don't pick them back up. And, how hard is it to pull this off? Not very, if you do it a certain way. Why do people mostly fail? Because they don't do it. I know this sounds simple. So you go to your doctor, right? And your doctor doesn't think you're getting enough exercise. So your doctor says, okay, here's what I want you to do. You need to exercise at least 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And you're sitting there going, your mama, it's not happening. Most people give up on a habit before they even start, or within 2 weeks of starting it. And the reason is because they try to eat the whole pie in one bite. It's just like smashing the pie in your face. How do you eat a whole pie? One piece at a time. So what we know from the neuroscience and the behavioral science is this: if you want to build a habit, let's say it is exercise, do it 5 minutes a day, every day. Not 30, not an hour. You don't have to die on the Peloton or whatever the latest thing is. But just do it. Same thing with meditation. You can't meditate for 10 or 15 minutes? Meditate for 2, but do it every day. And if you start these repetitive building of habits, even in short little pieces, after a few weeks, you'll start to naturally expand the amount of time you do it, because it feels good and you feel better after you're done. So that's how you build a habit. And if you're thinking, okay, I can probably do that, but I keep forgetting to do these things, here's what the behavioral science tells us about that. Maybe you got an Apple Watch, you got your smartphone, it's got little reminder things, it beeps you, because this thing really irritates me. Beeps me and goes, breathe. So you think I'm not, So, but anyway, the data tells us that good old-fashioned Post-it notes are 40% more effective at getting people to continue a new habit as opposed to electronic reminders. So what we tell people is, get some nice colorful Post-it notes, write down the things you want to focus on, whether it's mindful moment, or whatever, and put them up in places where you'll see them. The dashboard of your car, upper screen of your computer, the mirror in your bathroom. That's going to get you more, oh yeah, I got to remember to do that. That'll get it going for you. So use that method, it works. The last thing, but it's not least, is self-compassion. Mindful people have this ability, more than those who are mindless, to be merciful with themselves. Okay? And so self-compassion is really the capacity to be as good and kind to yourself as you would be to your best friend. And when you ask people about that, do you treat yourself with the same kind of kindness and understanding you do your best friend? Most of them, no. Most of us don't. I heard a kind of a quip about that on the radio. I think it was on NPR, where it had this Australian guy and this American guy, and they were talking about culture and judgment and punitive and all this stuff, and why are we so hard on each other and on ourselves and everything. And the Australian guy says, I think I know why. And the other guy says, why? He goes, well, when our countries got populated, you Americans, we, in Australia, we got the criminals. You got the Puritans, so we're much better at it than you are. Anyway, the point being, we're not generally good at forgiving ourselves, giving ourselves a break, so on and so forth. So I'm gonna wrap this up by telling you a story called My Good Enough Story. About 10, 12 years ago, I was at a place in my life where I did not feel good about me. I'd made some personal and some professional mistakes, bad calls, and I was really on myself. Of course, I was raised Catholic, so that tells you a little bit. But I was like, I was doing the mental self-flagellation thing big time. So, I'm a psychotherapist, right? So I'm supposed to know how to handle this. So I'm saying to myself, I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking, well, I just need a vacation. I just got to check out for a while. So I called a buddy of mine who's a retired psychologist and has the proverbial cabin in the Rockies. So I called him up. I said, hey, can I come out and hang out at your cabin for a long weekend, decompress, sort of put my head back on straight? He says, yeah, sure, that'd be great. He says, I'm going to be there, and our other friend Tom's a carpenter, is going to be there. So it'll be just the three guys for a long weekend. And I said, great, sounds good. Flew to Denver, rented a car, drove up. Got to the cabin that evening, three guys sit down, we have dinner. They're like talking it up, having fun and everything. I'm sitting on the mugwump, yeah, whatever, that sort of thing. We all go to bed. Next morning, I'm first up because I couldn't sleep. And I make the coffee, get myself a cup. I go out on the porch, sit down on the porch in a chair, to have my coffee, and it's raining. So I'm there with my coffee. Of course it's raining. I'm an external locus of control big time, So it's raining out here, it's raining in here. So I'm sitting there feeling sorry for myself. And out comes Tom, the carpenter, with his cup of coffee. Now Tom, who I've known forever, is probably the least psychological person I know. And when you start talking about psychology with this guy, you just see him just like glaze over. So we're sitting there for a moment. He turns to me, he goes, Phil, how you doing? So I unload. I back the truck up and pull that lever. I tell him everything. I've screwed up this, I messed up that, what was I thinking, on and on. Go through this whole harangue. I get done, I look over at Tom, he's just sitting there. I thought, that was dumb, Tom's not gonna grab onto this. And all of a sudden he goes, Phil, you see the roof over the porch here? I said, sure. He says, you see the joists they use to put, and I said, yeah. And he goes, they're not big enough. Eventually they're gonna bow. I said, okay. He says, you see the metal work they use to put, and I said, yeah. He goes, it's not the best. It's gonna corrode eventually. And he said, do you see where the roof line of the porch meets the roof line of the cabin? I said, yeah. He says, I can tell just by looking at it, it's a little off. I said, so what's your point? He goes, are you dry? I said, yeah. He goes, it's good enough. And the carpenter got up, walked in the cabin, and left the psychotherapist on the porch. So I leave that with you just with the idea that, again, when you're mindful, when your default mode is to be more in charge of you as opposed to having the world be in charge of you, it's also easier to have more compassion for yourself as well as for other people. Okay, that's my wrap, and I'm sticking to it. If you have any questions, comments, I'd be happy to entertain them, but I see we're out of time. So, and being hurry sick and everything, we'll wrap up. But if any of you have a couple of questions, I'd be happy to entertain them after we're done. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.